Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Amanda Hooper from the National Women's Law Center, and I will be moderator for today's webinar, Set Up for Success, Supporting Parents in Low-Wage Jobs and Their Children. We have just a few technical notes before we begin the presentations. First, all lines will be on mute during today's webinar. We will be taking questions after the experts have finished with their presentations, but you can submit questions throughout the webinar by typing it into the designated area on your control panel and hitting send. Second, we will also be recording the webinar, and you will receive a link to the recording of the presentation, as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides and additional resources within the next few days. And before we start the presentations, we'd like to just quickly get a better idea of who is on the webinar with us today. So you should see shortly a poll question pop up on your screen. So first, it looks like the poll is live now. Which of these best describes you? Are you an advocate, a policymaker, a student, or an academic? So we'll just give it a few seconds for folks to weigh in. You can just click on the right answer or the answer that fits you best. And looks like most folks have voted at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Looks like we have 83% advocates on with us today, 7% policymakers, 11% students, and 6% academics. And our second quick poll question is, what are you hoping to get from this webinar? And this is one where you should be able to select multiple answers. So the few answers that we have available are data on parents in the low-wage workforce, information about best practices and policies on scheduling and childcare, messaging that links parents and children's well-being to policy, recommendations for organizations that are building coalitions or campaigns, or all of the above. And again, it looks like these are longer answers, so I'm just going to give a few more seconds for folks to select all of the answers that fit them best. Okay, it looks like most folks have weighed in, so I'm just going to go ahead and close out the poll. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It looks like about 37% of people are looking for data on parents in the low-wage workforce, 32% information about best practices and policies, 22% on the messaging, 22% recommendations for orgs building coalitions, and 52% all of the above. And so thank you again, everyone, for participating in that. And without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to Amy Matsui from the National Women's Law Center. Amy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I'd like to echo Amanda's welcome to all of you for our webinar, Setting Families Up for Success, Advancing an Advocacy Framework for Low-Wage Working Parents and Their Children. We know that all parents want the best for their children, but millions of parents across the country work in jobs with low wages, challenging scheduling practices, and minimal benefits. Unpredictable and unstable schedules can leave many of these parents struggling to arrange and afford the high-quality childcare and early educational opportunities that their children need to succeed in school and beyond. This is a critically important point because we know from a large body of research that children growing up in poor or low-income families tend to have lower academic achievement relative to their peers from higher-income families. This is likely due not only to limited resources, but also to the stress experienced by family members. And this stress can be exacerbated when a parent is working an erratic schedule, which can make it even harder for them to balance work and family responsibilities. Like low income, parents' non-standard work schedules are linked to poorer behavioral and cognitive outcomes for children. For example, studies have linked parents' non-standard work to children's behavior problems, with larger effects often observed in families in which the parents work in lower wage jobs. Children's cognitive development may also be affected. So young children of parents employed in low-wage jobs with non-standard or otherwise erratic schedules and little control over their work may especially be at risk of poorer behavioral and cognitive outcomes. This has the potential to undermine school readiness and later academic performance. And while high-quality early care and education programs could help these children gain the early math, language, literacy, social, emotional, and learning skills they need to enter school ready to succeed, Their parents' non-standard and volatile schedules make it more challenging for them to access such programs. Few childcare or early education programs operate during early morning, evening, overnight, or weekend hours, or are able to accommodate a constantly shifting schedule. At the National Women's Law Center, we've been exploring the connection between parents' low-wage work and children's development and well-being. We're at the forefront of developing proposals that combine policies and practices that address this connection. And we feel strongly that the link between the conditions of parents' work and children's outcome is a powerful advocacy tool for advancing improvements in scheduling, childcare, and other work and family policies. Today, we're hoping to foster a conversation about these tools and advancing a more robust policy agenda. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today and facilitating the questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. And one more. We have 4 expert presenters today. Julia Henley is Associate Professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, where she co-directs the Employment Instability, Family Wellbeing, and Social Policy Network. A primary focus of Professor Henley's scholarship is to advance understanding of the economic and caregiving strategies of low-income families, with particular attention to the prevalence and consequences of irregular and predictable work schedules, how work schedules shape children's care arrangements, and how well child care subsidies and other public benefits serve low-income families, especially those with precarious work schedules. Julie Voetman is Director of Income Support Policy and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. She works on a range of issues involving job quality and supports for low-income women and their families, including minimum wage and scheduling policies and child care assistance. She also contributes to the Center's work on federal budget and tax policies. Prior to joining the Center in 2010, Ms. Voetman was an associate with Covington & Burling LLP in Washington, D.C. She's a graduate of Furman University and Georgetown University Law Center. Karen Schulman is the Child Care and Early Learning Research Director at the National Women's Law Center. She researches and writes about child care and early education policies. She received her bachelor's degree from Williams College and her master's degree in public policy from Duke University. Prior to joining the center, she worked at the Children's Defense Fund. And Jessica Bartholow is a policy advocate at the Western Center on Law and Poverty with nearly 2 decades of experience in anti-poverty organizing, advocacy, and program development at the local, state, and national levels. She's led in the development and passage of several pieces of new law to expand opportunities and protect the futures of low-income parents and children. Jessica holds a master's degree in political science and is a recipient of the Wellstone Wheeler National Anti-Hunger Advocate of the Year Award. Next slide, please. Today, we are trying to cover a lot of ground, but we hope all of it's going to be useful for you. We're going to cover the data about worker schedules and child care access. We are then going to talk about some scheduling policies that can make a difference for working families, as well as child care policies that are important for working families. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about finding a path for unity on the path towards family economic security. Just to remind you, as Amanda mentioned, at the end of the presentation we'll have time for questions, which we can't take by phone, but please use the chat function on your screen to send in your questions. And then after the webinar, we will email you links to today's materials. So with that and all the ground that we have to cover, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Julia Henley. Julie, take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, I am going to, for my section of the webinar, first provide a brief review of some important labor market trends that disproportionately and negatively affect low-income workers, including parents of young children. And then I'll give particular attention to work schedules as a source of instability, and I'll highlight some national data on the prevalence of jobs with non-standard and precarious work schedules. And then I'll take a little time to lay out why these labor market trends matter for workers and families and for child care access and child care policy. Next slide. So the employment instability in the United States has increased over the past 4 decades due to structural changes in the economy, weakened labor laws, and evolving employer practices that pass risk from the market onto employees and their families to absorb. These changes have been felt across demographic groups, but disproportionately by less educated younger workers and workers of color, all of whom have experienced relative declines in earnings even before the economic downturn. Low-income parents have been hit especially hard. The problem is not just unemployment, but also underemployment and work schedule instability. In particular, employer practices around scheduling contribute to the precarious nature of employment today, especially among hourly workers. So let me first show you some statistics on unemployment and underemployment before I dig into the data on work schedules, where I'll spend most of my time. Next slide. So this slide shows two indicators of economic instability: unemployment rates in red and duration of unemployment in blue. These are national data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can see that the jump from 2007 to 2010 gives an indication of the seriousness of the Great Recession. You can see unemployment went up from 4.6% in 2007 to 9.7% in 2010. And the mean weeks unemployed went from 18 weeks to 35 weeks over that same period. Now the unemployment rate's down from 9.7% in 2010 to 5%, but duration of unemployment spells are still pretty high at 28.4 weeks, still above, well above actually, the 2007 numbers. And underemployment continues to be a serious problem as well, as this next slide shows. You can advance. There we go. Workers are increasingly finding it difficult to get full-time work. While involuntary part-time jobs are always more common during sluggish economic periods, the problem has been especially severe during and since the Great Recession. At its peak, about 9 million workers were identified as working part-time hours for economic reasons. This is the conventional definition of involuntary part-time work. And this is down to 5.8 million workers today, but it's still a long way from where it was during previous recovery periods. Next slide. Okay, so now let me turn to some data on non-standard and precarious work schedules. As I said earlier, work schedules are an important source of instability for workers and their families. According to recent research from the Urban Institute, 30% of low-income American workers now work the majority of their work hours during non-standard times. Half of part-time workers do, and even more working parents do. In several studies, my colleague Susan Lambert and I have shown that in addition to non-standard timing, low-wage jobs are characterized by schedule unpredictability, variability in the number and timing of work hours, and limited employee control over work schedules. I'm going to share some national data with you on these indicators of work schedules. The statistics I'll show you in a minute come from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and I just want to say a little bit about this data because it's not a data set that covers all workers, but it's a nationally representative sample of individuals. They were adolescents in 1997 when they were first interviewed, and the survey uses a panel design that interviewed the sample annually up until 2011, and then since 2011, every 2 years. So in 2011, what's exciting about this data is several new items about work schedules were added to the survey. So the respondents in 2011 were 28 to 33 years old, and the work schedule items that were at unpredictability, variability in hours, and lack of schedule control. So you can advance to the next slide. These are the questions as they're asked to respondents. And you can see the first question asks, how far in advance do you usually know what days and hours you'll need to work? And respondents are asked to choose either 1 week or less, between 1 or 2 weeks, between 3 and 4 weeks, or 4 weeks or more. And I'll show you the data on the percentage that say 1 week or less in a second. Then there's 3 questions that are asked about how much work hours vary. The questions asked in the last month: what's the greatest numbers of hours you've worked? What's the fewest number you've worked, not including vacation, etc.? And how many hours do you work typically in a normal week? And I'll show you some data on that question, those set of items as well. And then finally, which of the following statements best describe how your work hours are decided? And you can see they get 5 choices there that vary in how much input employees have over their schedule. And I'll show you how many respondents say starting and finishing times are decided by my employer and I cannot change them on my own. So they have no control or no input into their schedule. Okay, next slide. So this slide shows descriptive statistics on these 3 indicators of precarious schedules for different subgroups of hourly workers. And the majority of workers in the United States work hourly. So the first column, hour fluctuations, shows how much work hours vary in a month relative to people's usual weekly hours. So you can see in this national data that hours fluctuate a lot by more than 40% of workers' by more than 40% of the workers' usual number of hours. And that's true for mothers and fathers and across the 3 racial and ethnic groups that are listed here. Full-time workers in low-wage jobs see the least hour fluctuations, and part-time workers see the most fluctuations. You can see that in that first column at the very bottom 2 rows. The second column, short notice, indicates that 1/3 to 1/2 of workers across these demographic groups receive their schedules with 1 week or less advance notice. And finally, the third column, schedule input, shows that close to 50% of workers in each demographic group report having no control over their work schedule. They say that their employer entirely decides their starting and ending times without their input at all. We've also looked at occupations at particular risk of these work schedules. Next slide. And as you can see from this slide, the prevalence is quite high across these 4 occupations, all of which commonly employ low-wage working parents. Next slide. So it's unsettling to find that non-standard and precarious work schedules are so widespread, especially among these early career workers, because research suggests that these job characteristics increase employee stress, create work-family conflict, interfere with activities outside of work, and may also negatively impact child development. Much of the research in this area up until a few years ago had focused on non-standard timing jobs, but newer research has started to address the effects of unpredictability, variable hours, and schedule flexibility on these outcomes. For example, in a survey of retail sales associates, Susan Lambert and I show that employees who report more unpredictable schedules and less control over their schedules also report greater worker stress and more difficulties managing the demands of work with non-work responsibilities, such as attending medical appointments, children's school activities, and satisfying their own educational commitments. And our research team has recently replicated these findings in a sample of low-income working parents with young children who work in a variety of occupations, not just retail. So what about childcare, which is the focus of this webinar? What are the implications of non-standard and precarious work schedules on parents' childcare options? Next slide. Very few childcare centers and preschools offer care outside of daytime weekday hours. And for financial reasons, as well as child development reasons, childcare centers typically require kids to participate in a set childcare schedule, often full-time, which can be difficult for parents needing to satisfy variable work hours or part-time work. On the other hand, licensed family childcare homes are more likely than centers to offer care in the evening, but still few provide weekend care. It's unlicensed home-based providers who are most likely to care for children in the evening, overnight, or on weekends, and these providers are also most likely to provide variable last-minute care. The next slide illustrates some of these different scheduling options by childcare type. So these data come from the 2012 National Survey of Early Care and Education, or the NSECE. NSECE data are newly available from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families. This bar graph illustrates recent analyses that were published by OPRE. It's not data that I've personally analyzed. I just want to give credit where credit's due, but rather it comes from a fact sheet put out by OPRE, and I've provided the link there on the webinar PowerPoint. So these data provide nationally representative estimates for child care and early education providers serving children 5 and under. And on the slide, I'm showing you the percent of providers who offer care during non-standard hours by child care type. The NSEC data identifies 4 types of child care and early education providers. Center-based providers, that's the purple bar to the very right of each cluster. Listed home providers, the green bars, these are family child care providers who were identified in the sampling frame through official state and national registries and other lists. And then the 2 additional types of home-based providers who are not registered, licensed, or otherwise listed, those that are what are called unlisted but paid, those are the red bars, and those that are unlisted but unpaid, the blue bars. So these last 2 groups are likely similar to what many of you know as family, friend, and neighbor providers or informal, maybe kith and kin care. As you can see from this slide, the providers who offer care evening, overnight, and weekend hours are overwhelmingly those unlisted home-based providers, or the FFN, family, friend, and neighbor providers. And although not shown on the graph, the unlisted providers, those that are most likely to provide this kind of care, are also the most prevalent. So 2.73 million providers fall into that unlisted, unpaid group, and they serve over 4 million children. Another 2.34 million children are served by almost 1 million unlisted paid providers. By comparison, 118,000 listed family child care providers exist, serving 751,000 children. So you can see that it's really the unlisted providers that are doing the lion's share of work caring for kids outside of daytime weekday hours. Next. So this slide makes really the same point as the national data on the last slide, but it shows administrative data from providers in Cook County, Illinois, maintained by the Illinois Network of Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies. I pulled these statistics from a report that was published by the Illinois Action for Children, and note that with these data, we can't look at unlicensed care or unlicensed, unlisted homes, since they don't appear in the Illinois administrative data. But you can see that, again, child care centers are less likely to provide the care in non-standard hours than licensed family child care homes. So overall, the data on the last two slides demonstrate that families who work non-standard hours or who have variable and unpredictable work schedules have fewer child care options, are less able to use center care during working hours. It doesn't mean they don't use them at other times, and disproportionately have access to home-based, especially informal care. Research also shows that it's relatively common for families with complicated work schedules like these to use multiple child care providers to respond to variable caregiving needs, since it's often difficult for one single provider to be available on demand and at the whim of a changing work schedule. Next slide. Let me end by making a few comments about how the dimensions of employment that I've been talking about matter for child care subsidy policy. I know we'll take this up in a later part of the webinar, so I'm just going to say a couple things now. In particular, I wanted to make the point that employment instability, including unemployment, underemployment, and these precarious work schedules that I've been talking about, all contribute to child care subsidy instability and to child care discontinuity, losing a child care arrangement. One of the key goals of child care subsidies is to facilitate employment, and many studies show strong positive employment effects on child care subsidies. But reducing the cost of care, by reducing the cost of care, subsidies seem to clearly help parents work, and this is good news, right? However, research also suggests that eligibility rules do not align well with the reality of parents' jobs. It can be quite difficult to access and maintain program benefits for parents in high turnover jobs or whose jobs have variable and unpredictable hours and schedules. In a study of the subsidy program in Illinois and New York that was funded by the Administration for Children and Families, Heather Sandstrom, Amy Cleasons, and I found that job characteristics, including job loss, fluctuating and unpredictable work hours, and other forms of irregular work, increase the risk of leaving the subsidy program. We also found that there's greater burden of becoming and remaining eligible for subsidies when a job is non-standard or irregular in some ways. With these jobs, there can be additional paperwork, more rigorous employer verification, and more processing errors. While I don't have time to talk about the findings from this study today, there is a link to the final ACF report that's going to be provided to you in the webinar materials. Okay, so I will stop here. I've probably talked too long, and I'll pass the baton to Julie Boatman, who will take up the next section of our presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. What I would like to cover now is some of the key policies and strategies that can actually improve work schedules for parents in low-wage jobs and benefit their children at the same time. I will start by laying out the key elements of fair schedules that are particularly important for working parents and their families. If you could go to the next slide. So to start with, one really important element, of course, is asking for and respecting employee input into work schedules. When employers give employees a voice in their schedules by granting requests made so that employees can meet caregiving responsibilities or other obligations outside of work, that can help reduce stress for both working parents and their children, and it can also give them more time to spend together as a family. Another important element is more advanced notice of work schedules. When employers give workers at least 2 or 3 weeks notice of their schedules, working parents are better able to secure childcare and balance their work and caregiving responsibilities, and that could reduce, again, some of the stress experienced by parents as well as the negative impact that can have on their children. It's also important to discourage last-minute changes to scheduled shifts. When employers avoid using on-call shifts, where employees are told to hold a shift open in case they have to work, but don't find out whether or not they will actually be called in and be paid for a shift until 24 hours or even just a couple of hours before their shift. That's called an on-call shift. And if employers avoid using those, avoid sending employees home early from shifts that they are scheduled for, avoid making other last-minute changes, or pay workers extra when they do use these practices, working parents are better able to manage last-minute changes to childcare arrangements and also minimize the income loss that can create significant financial strains for them. And the last principle is to expand opportunities for part-time workers who, as Julie mentioned, are particularly vulnerable to experiencing these precarious work scheduling practices. But when employers guarantee a minimum number of weekly work hours, offer additional hours of work to existing part-time employees before they hire new employees, and ensure that part-time and full-time employees are treated equally when it comes to their pay and benefits and promotion opportunities, parents who work part-time can get the more stable schedules and more opportunity to secure the pay and benefits that they need to support their families. If you could go to the next slide. I now want to just quickly cover a few examples of these principles in practice, starting with the San Francisco Retail Workers Bill of Rights, which went into effect about a year ago. It's a city ordinance, and it's the most comprehensive example we have of fair scheduling policies enacted in legislation. So what does this Retail Workers Bill of Rights do? First, it promotes more advanced notice of schedules in a few ways. At the outset, before a new employee even starts working, their employer has to provide a good faith estimate of the minimum number of shifts they will be scheduled for each month. So that helps to avoid situations where a worker thinks she is going to be getting 30 or 35 hours a week and ends up with 10 or 15 hours a week. Employers also have to post schedules for hourly workers 2 weeks in advance. And if an employer makes changes to that schedule with less than 7 days notice, but more than 24 hours notice, the employee receives an extra hour of pay for each shift that is changed. And if the employer changes the schedule in less than 24 hours before the scheduled shift, the employee receives 2 hours of additional pay if the shift was less than 4 hours, and 4 hours of additional pay if the shift was 4 hours or more. The Bill of Rights also promotes full-time work by requiring employers to offer additional work hours to existing qualified part-time employees before they hire new employees. And it limits the use of the on-call shifts that I mentioned a few minutes ago by requiring that if an employee is scheduled for an on-call shift, meaning they had to hold the hours open and available, but they're ultimately not called into work, the employee is entitled to 2 hours of pay for a shift of less than 4 hours and 4 hours of pay if the shift was 4 hours or more. And finally, the ordinance has part-time parity provisions, which means that employers have to treat part-time employees on par with their full-time counterparts, essentially full-time employees who are doing the same job as part-time employees. They have to be treated equally with respect to rate of pay, ability to earn paid or unpaid time off, and access to promotion opportunities. Employers also can't require employees to have open availability to receive full-time status. One practice that you see in a number of low-wage jobs is that in order to even be eligible to get full-time hours, an employer will say that someone literally has to be available 24/7, which often isn't even actually a promise that they will get full-time hours, just a prerequisite to getting full-time hours. But the San Francisco ordinance prohibits that practice, which of course is particularly detrimental to working parents who can't be available 24/7 due to their caregiving obligations. Now, about a dozen states and the District of Columbia have introduced legislation with at least some provisions similar to San Francisco's ordinance, and there is a federal model as well called the Schedules That Work Act, which I will cover now on the next slide. So the Schedules That Work Act was reintroduced just about a year ago. It currently has 100 co-sponsors in the House and 18 in the Senate, and this bill also responds to workers' need for a say in their work schedules and for more predictability and stability in their jobs. So it has a few key elements. First is a right to request for all employees. So that means that any employee can come to their employer and request a schedule that meets their needs, and employers are prohibited from retaliating against employees for making such requests. It also requires employers to grant schedule requests that are made for specific reasons, which is to meet caregiving responsibilities, to work a second job for employees who are part-time, to pursue education and training, or to manage an employee's own serious health condition. So employers can deny those requests if they have a bona fide business reason to do so, but otherwise, if a request is made for those reasons, the employer needs to grant it. And that's, again, for all employees. Then for hourly workers in restaurant, retail, and building cleaning jobs, the bill has additional protections, including 2 weeks advance notice of work schedules, additional compensation for last-minute schedule changes. So that is an additional hour of pay for on-call shifts or schedule changes made with less than 24 hours notice. It also provides an extra hour of pay for split shifts, which are shifts with non-consecutive hours that include a break of an hour or more. So say you're scheduled from 8 to noon, and then also from 2:30 to 5. That's a split shift, since you don't really have time to go home or do anything in between your shifts, but typically you're unpaid for the couple of hours in between. So the bill would discourage that practice, or at least compensate employees with an extra hour of pay on days that they have to work a split shift. And the last piece is reporting time pay, which means that employees who are sent home from work early would be paid for at least 4 hours of work, or the hours in the scheduled shift, whichever is less, so that you're less likely to end up in a situation where you've had to arrange for childcare and transportation and paid for all of those things, and then get to work only to work for 45 minutes and then told to go home with having spent more to get to work than you actually earned that day. And I will just note that these provisions apply to restaurant, retail, and building cleaning jobs because, as Julie mentioned, those are industries in which scheduling abuses are most well documented. But the bill also authorizes the Department of Labor to evaluate the extent of unpredictable and unstable scheduling practices in other industries and designate additional occupations to be covered by its provisions. We can go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So we do think legislation is critical to ensure fairer schedules for all workers, but I think it's important to note that there are a number of companies that are already providing better schedules to their hourly employees and showing that these practices are not incompatible with running a business. In fact, providing more stable and predictable hours can mean lower turnover and more stability for businesses too. So in the Law Center's report, Set Up for Success, we talk about a number of private sector models, and the link to that report is included in these slides and will also be included in the follow-up materials that you get. So I won't go over them in too much detail. I do just want to highlight in particular Walmart, since that's not necessarily known as a model of worker-friendly practices, but thanks to the really persistent organizing and demands from our Walmart, which is a grassroots organization of Walmart workers, the company really has made strides and has promised that by the end of 2016, it will provide all workers with their schedules at least 2.5 weeks in advance and make new fixed shift and flex shift options available. A fixed shift would guarantee the same weekly hours to an employee for as long as a year, and flex shifts would allow workers to build their own schedules from the hours available. So definitely important progress. And again, I would direct your attention to the Set Up for Success report to see a number of additional examples. And I have just one more slide to wrap up quickly. Before I turn it over to Karen, I do want to note that polling shows that people across the country, including business owners, are really starting to recognize the need for fair work schedules. I think that perhaps the most interesting one on this slide is that in a poll commissioned by the Council of State Chambers of Commerce, 78% of business executives surveyed, so business CEOs and higher level business people who are members of chambers of commerce in general. They support scheduling policies that limit employers' ability to use on-call scheduling and require them to give employees sufficient advance notice of their work schedules. So clearly this is a policy issue that is gaining momentum, and linking the need for fair work schedules to the need for affordable, accessible, high-quality childcare for working families can make the case even stronger. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen Schulman, our Childcare and Early Learning Research Director here at the Law Center.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the childcare policies now. So stable, high-quality childcare can reduce the stress that parents in low-wage jobs experience as a result of their often unpredictable work schedules and other challenging aspects of their jobs, and can help counter the negative effects of this stress on their children. Yet, as Julie Henley discussed earlier, those very same challenging work schedules make it extremely difficult for parents in low-wage jobs to find childcare that meets their needs, or to get childcare assistance to help them pay for high-quality childcare, which is difficult to afford on their own with their low wages. But there are federal, state, and local policies and private sector practices that can help families, these families access the high-quality early care and education that helps parents work and helps children succeed in school and in life. So the first strategy I'm going to talk about is expanding investments in childcare and early education. It's critical to increase funding for the Child Care and Development Block Grant. That's our major federal child care program, which would make it possible to make child care assistance available to more low-income families and support efforts to improve the quality of care. Just 1 out of 6 children eligible for federal child care assistance currently receives it, and the number of children receiving assistance has actually declined in recent years. Congress reauthorized the Child Care and Development Block Grant in 2014 with tremendous bipartisan support. Yet Congress has not appropriated the funding necessary to implement the important reforms included in the law, which were intended to make it easier for families to get and keep assistance and to improve the health, safety, and quality of child care. Recently, the House Appropriations Bill for the coming fiscal year included an increase of only $41 million for child care, and the Senate Appropriations Bill included just $25 million, which is just a small fraction of what would be needed to cover the additional costs of implementing the law and avoiding any further losses of children. So significant new federal and state funding would allow states to effectively implement the reauthorization law and achieve its important goals while enabling more, not fewer, families to receive child care assistance. There is some proposals to expand investments in child care. For example, the Child Care Access to Resources for Early Learning, or the Child Care Act, would provide $25 billion in new funding over 5 years for early care and education. The funding would be used to expand access to high-quality child care for all children under age 4 in families with incomes below 200% of poverty by 2021, and a small portion of overall funding would be reserved for grants to states to support child care during non-traditional and unpredictable hours, like the hours many of the families we're talking about today work. Another strategy is to provide tax assistance to help families meet the high cost of child care. The federal Child Independent Care Tax Credit should be improved to better help families meet the high cost of child care, and it should be made refundable so that families with limited and no federal tax liability could benefit from it. States can also adopt new child independent care tax provisions or expand and improve the tax credits they already have. 25 states and the District of Columbia currently offer state child independent care tax provisions, and in 12 of these states the provisions are refundable. We could increase investments in high-quality early care and education programs, including federal Head Start and Early Head Start programs and state pre-kindergarten programs. These programs give children in low-income families the opportunity to participate in high-quality early learning experiences that prepare them to succeed in school, but they are serving only a fraction of preschoolers. The proposed federal Strong Start for America's Children Act would make high-quality preschool available to all children in low and moderate income families. It would make high-quality preschool available to them through state-federal partnerships, and pre-kindergarten programs would have to meet several quality standards. We could also help workers access and afford child care through their employers, who could offer financial assistance and could assist their employees in identifying child care options that cover their work hours. In addition to expanded investments, it's also important to think about how we actually craft the child care and early education policies and programs to meet the needs of low-age working families. If we could go to the next slide. This Child Care and Development Block Grant Reauthorization Law I was talking about has a number of provisions aimed at facilitating families' access to child care assistance that may be particularly beneficial to parents who experience frequent changes in work status, work hours, and income. For example, under the law, states must allow families to remain eligible for child care assistance for a full 12 months without having to recertify their continued eligibility for assistance. And they can remain eligible through temporary changes in their work hours or job status, enabling their children to stay in the same child care arrangement throughout the period. States must take into account fluctuations in income by determining a family's eligibility for child care assistance. For example, by averaging income over an extended time period so that a temporary spike in income does not put the family over the income limit to qualify for assistance. States also have greater flexibility to authorize care based on the child's developmental needs and well-being, rather than based strictly on a parent's work, education, or training hours. As a result, states can pay for a regular child care slot even if the family has even if a parent has varying work hours that do not always precisely match that child care schedule. We can also encourage coordination between pre-kindergarten programs and child care providers to meet the needs of parents with non-traditional work schedules. And we can also support family, friend, and neighbor care as an option for these families who prefer it, or, as we were talking about earlier, lack other options that meet their work hours. Many states are limiting the use of FFN care, and we're concerned about this because it is often families' only option. Okay, so next slide. Finally, it's important to expand supports for child care providers. It's important to remember that many of the providers we're talking about are women, and many of them are low-wage workers themselves, and they're not earning very high incomes, and they're struggling to support their families too. So we need to increase child care providers' compensation and professional development opportunities, and give them a greater voice in the policy-making process. There are some initiatives to increase their compensation, like the TEACH model that's been adopted in many states that allows them to get scholarships for education and then get higher salaries. There is also a number of states are allowing home-based child care providers to unionize and bargain for benefits. We can also provide financial incentives and technical assistance to encourage child care centers and family child care providers to offer care during non-traditional hours. And finally, we can invest in initiatives that support FFN providers, these family, friend, and neighbor providers, through education and training, mentoring, networking opportunities, and help accessing other resources. There's a lot more details to provide, but you can check out our report for all the details. And now I will turn it over to Jessica Bartholow.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Great.
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you. Again, my name is Jessica Bartholow. I'm with the Western Center on Law and Poverty, located here in California. We're one of those several poverty law centers throughout the country that work in our state capitals and in the nation's capital on representing legal services and working on policy change related to low-income Americans. I'm going to be talking about the ways in which California and our coalition building that we're doing here is helping us to find some unity in how we talk about family economic security, about low-wage work, and kind of the more uncomfortable intersections of them. If your hands are sweating at the end of the conversation here in my part of the presentation, then I have done a good job. Because, as you know, anybody who's working in these areas, some of these conversations in the middle of what it means to be a low-income working American with kids, and the conversations with people working in the various policy areas can be complicated. I'm going to try to talk you through some of those, let you know what kinds of tensions we've encountered and are pushing through, and how we're pushing through them, what learning opportunities there are. So next slide. Along the way, as you, next slide, please. As we go through our slides, you're going to be seeing, Twitter tags, hashtags, Twitter handles. Please consider these. You'll have access to the PowerPoint afterward. You can take a look at them as I'm speaking if I get too monotone for you. But take a look at these partners. These are various partners that we're working with in coalition here in California, and they have great things to say, great work to highlight. So, on the first point here, the first slide I want to talk about is this kind of intersectionality between how do we talk about work and making sure that we're holding high values of making employment a real option for every low-income American, right? But also trying to make sure we
we at least represent the challenges of people who can't find work, and to prevent long-lasting harm to children and vulnerable adults, and treat them with dignity while they're accessing services when they can't find work. So often you may hear, the high talking point, whether it's in a political campaign or a policy campaign, that nobody who works full-time should experience poverty. And from a poverty advocate, somebody who works mostly in the area of poverty, public benefit access, this is really hard to hear, because we work to try to make sure nobody experiences poverty. As a reminder, the poverty threshold is a line defined by the federal government under which anybody living is unable to meet their basic needs. Basic needs like food and housing, diapers if they have children, health care if they have co-pays or medication, or they have to pay for their health care. So as we think about work and how we talk about work, one of the first kind of threshold challenges for us is how to talk about work at the intersection of public benefit access. That we should make it available for everybody. That everybody should have the ability to find work. That full employment should be a goal. We'd like to bring that conversation back into the dialogue, and we know there's a national conversation about full employment. That should be a goal. And for people who can't work, either because there is high employment in their area or they're unable to work, we need to make sure that there's a safety net that prevents harm to them. Not all jobs are created equally, and they're not distributed equally as well. This space about talking about access to work and opportunity for work gives us a chance to talk about that. For example, recently we held a conversation with Representative Bobby Scott on working families in LA at the Black Worker Center. And there we talked about how access to government jobs and creation of jobs is actually leaving behind the Black community in the same communities where we may have funding to create buildings or build roads. People who live in those communities have not been offered the jobs. So working within this space of who has the right to a work, making work an option for everybody, it also allows us to lift up inequities based on gender, inequities based on race, and these can be really hard conversations to have. Criminal, prior criminal conviction, but they are important, and they help us to get to a better policy. And the last thing I want to say about messaging and unity building here is that when we talk only about low-income people and workers having a right to prevent poverty, we kind of drive the narrative into this place of speaking about the good poor versus the bad poor, and that is very dangerous when it comes to public social safety nets. When we get into this space where, well, if people who can work would want to work, then they shouldn't have to be poor. And it really leaves behind the details of what is happening on the ground, that people are being systemically pushed out of jobs, that their neighborhoods are being pushed out of jobs, that they've never even had an opportunity to work, they've been in public school systems that haven't prepared them for work, etc. So I put down here, I list the public social safety nets if it's something that you're not familiar with, if this area of conversation isn't, but these are the major ones. And one last thing I want to say about this intersectionality of work and public benefits and safety net is, as a public benefit, first and foremost, a public benefit or anti-hunger, anti-poverty advocate, somebody might say, well, why did you come to the low-wage work conversation? And the fact is, I didn't. It came to us. It came to Western Center and the other poverty law centers because in these programs, there are work-related sanctions. If a person does not have access to full-time work, they are more likely to be cut off of program due to work requirements and the work-first model of the TANF program. If they're a student in school and they're not able to secure 20 hours a week, they are ineligible for public benefits under the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as food stamps. We had families whose families were being sanctioned in the TANF program because their kids got sick and couldn't go to school, and they couldn't get the time off to get the doctor's note. These policies that sanction a family based on their school attendance of their child, there have even been proposals about sanctioning families based on their school academic record of their child. Again, as you heard earlier in the research, academic performance is harmed by low-wage work with unfair scheduling. So we kept seeing this impact of low-wage work and unfair scheduling coming into the public benefits program and hurting families that were really doing their best to escape poverty. So next slide, please. So the next slide I want to talk about is, if we can move to the next slide, is a couple of other places where we see intersectionality in the coalition work we're doing here in California. And just for reference, I know you heard at the beginning of the call, you will receive an email. It will have links to the organizations that we have been formulating here in coalition work, and some of our messaging, our story, our legislative advocacy, etc. So just know that that's coming your way after the webinar. So when we talk about after people have the right to work, and we strengthen the safety net for people who can't, we can move into the space of what it means to be able to bring home more money. So we've been building this narrative about wages, and here in California, as you know, we just passed a path towards minimum wage of $15 an hour as a floor for the state. Many other localities are raising higher. We've had several attempts at fair scheduling, and those efforts will continue here in the state legislature, but we also have several, one successful local campaign and several on their way. We've passed wage-less staff legislation, an earned income tax credit we have for the first time in California, and we've also passed wage garnishment laws and are working towards collective bargaining of some of the lowest wage workers in our workforce, which are childcare workers. So we talk about trying to move people into not earning more money. Many of these low-wage workers are working for corporations that are very well off and are making a lot of money. Low-wage workers, they're taking home small dollar amounts compared to what they're earning. So we have been focusing on making sure that they're able to bring home more of the dollars that they're earning, and that's how we've been talking about it. And how do we do that? These are 3 strategies that we've been using. I kind of listed the bullets here of things that we have achieved recently. And these have been achieved through broad coalition. The tension that we've been, addressing in some of these conversations, right, are, how do we talk about increasing access to paid family leave for workers who are lower wage, right? If your income today isn't enough to pay your rent and put food on the table, then having less than that amount because you took a paid family leave actually puts you, it doesn't actually help you. You may not be able to take the leave because you can't afford to, or you might be able to not take the leave because you don't have worker protection during that leave period. And so often as advocates we're told, well, you can't have both. You can't do all of these. But by working in coalition, we've confronted that and continue to push on, all of these levers to say, no, actually we can and we need to make paid family leave be a protected leave, make family leave be longer, make family leave have a more equitable distribution. And so just recently the governor signed legislation that increased the percent of wage replacement for families who are lower wage earning, and removed the 1-week waiting period, which was really detrimental to families who, again, couldn't pay their rent with, could barely pay their rent with full months of wages. And once they lose that 1 week in the vulnerable situations they were, it just wasn't a choice they could make. And so being able to talk about that relationship between, securing rights versus expanding them has been some tension pulls still here. But through coalition and being at the table on a regular basis, we've been working through them and continuing to move forward and build on each success. Another learning opportunity I just want to put out there is because for me, it was very instructive early on to understand the difference between paid sick time and paid family leave. The opposition on these policies will try to make them be the same thing, right? And so it is really important as you're creating your coalition and your conversation to be able to differentiate between paid sick time as a right of the worker and paid family leave as a policy that differentiates from that. All right, next slide, please. So in this next slide, I want to talk briefly about making excellent and affordable childcare. One of the biggest tensions here has been addressed in the previous speaker, so I won't spend much time onto it. I'll move on. But just, you know, acknowledge that in the room, every time we talk about expanding slots, we also have to understand that those, you know, people will tell us that those resources go towards expanding slots prevent us from being able to pay workers more and increase child care payment rates. And I've been really proud of a coalition here, Raising California Together, that has brought together parents, workers, advocates to be able to say, no, we don't want one or the other. We want a system that works for families and the workers and underscores their rights, including collective bargaining. And by doing so, it's one of the biggest anti-poverty coalitions I know that is talking about collective bargaining as a right for low-income workers. So I appreciate that, and I want to keep it on the list. Okay, moving on. We are about over time, so I want to go to the last slide here, and just reaffirm for people that when we work in the intersectionality of women and low-wage workforce, we will, as advocates, be told that we have to pit against, you know, one thing against another. You can't have both. And I'm asking you as advocates across the country to push up against that and actually understand that if we can grasp the narrative that we not only can we not ask for both or all, but that we actually have to in order to have a child care system that works, low-wage work be eliminated so that people are actually earning a living wage, etc. I want to just remind people that we will go ahead and send around, as we close up here, send around extra materials and provide an opportunity for people to ask questions and hand it back over to the facilitators of the call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I want to take the time to thank all of you for participating today. I apologize that we didn't get time to ask questions, to answer your questions live on the webinar, but as you can see from our presenters, there's a lot of material, a lot to work with, and we wanted to make sure that we gave you all of the information that we came here to present. We are going to send around these slides along with the materials that both Jess and Julie and the NWLC report and agenda, which were mentioned by some of our speakers. And in that follow-up email, we will also send the PowerPoint along with a survey which will allow you to ask any questions that you may have, as well as ask for resources of different kinds that the National Women's Law Center may be able to give you tailored assistance for you and your organization. So very briefly, I wanted to flag the last couple slides. This slide has links to NWLC's report and agenda, and we can move to the next one. And in addition, we have two fact sheets which kind of set up an advocacy framework which connects worker conditions and child outcomes in the context of moving scheduling policies and child care policies and investments forward. And we hope that you'll take a look at those and that those will be useful to you in your work. Next slide, please. And lastly, I wanted to make sure that you had contact information for our wonderful speakers and presenters, the experts who joined us on the call today, and the National Women's Law Center contacts as well. So again, I ask you to please join me in thanking our presenters, Dr. Julie Henley, Jessica Bartholow, Julie Voteman, and Karen Schulman, and to remind you that materials are going to be sent to you via email along with a survey which will allow you to ask questions and also for technical assistance from the National Women's Law Center, and to thank all of you so much for taking the time out of your busy days and schedules to join us on the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us, and that concludes today's webinar.